after we hear from our next speaker, Jill. And as I segue over to welcoming Jill, we've got a comment saying that this person wanted to thank Parents Beyond Breakup for running this series and including New Zealand. It's sorely needed, and it's needed that someone takes responsibility and leadership in driving this change. Thank you so much. And that gives me a perfect segue to welcome our second expert speaker today, Jill Goldson, coming in live from New Zealand. We did set out to cover Australia and New Zealand, and Jill, thank you for joining us. Jill is the award-winning founder of the Goldson model and an expert practitioner. She's published, she's a researcher, media commentator, and a trainer in the field of family mediation. She's got, well, you've got a lot of experience, I can see, Jill. You've run thousands of family mediations and advised government on policy on the family law interventions in the out-of-court space, which is very, very interesting today. Jill's also a Churchill Fellow. She's presented and taught her model for child inclusive practice, which I'd love to hear more about, in Europe and across Australasia, and is highly regarded for her work and her understanding of high conflict dispute and the urgent need to decrease parent-child contact problems. Jill has completed postgraduate studies in parental alienation and positions her work with child inclusive practice as a public health issue, which recognises the absolute devastation on parental conflict on children and the need to activate social policy which prioritises understanding and early prevention. And Jill, as if you hadn't done enough in this space, you've also written a book, Child Inclusion and Parenting Dispute Mediation, the Key to Keeping Family Separation Out of Court, and I believe that's currently in press. Jill, thank you for joining us from New Zealand today. Welcome. I might even start the conversation the same we did with Cheryl and ask you, how would you define parental alienation?
Thank you, JD, and thank you very much to the organisation for inviting me to be a speaker today, and as we say in New Zealand, kia ora. So I would probably just start then by going through the key questions about parental alienation, and then with a disclaimer that, of course, I see it as imperative, but we also look at the issue of child inclusion, which doesn't detract from the focus on parental alienation, but to me is a very important part of dealing with the subject. So to your question about defining parental alienation, I just read briefly from Matheson, Haynes and Turnbull, who I believe in their book have a very succinct and focused definition, which is that parental alienation is the outcome of the process where one parent, the alienating, aligned or preferred parent, engages in a variety of behaviours with the effect of damaging the relationship between the child and the other targeted, rejected parent. So I find that succinct and quite comprehensive in its own way. I completely agree with Cheryl that it is an abuse. I would also just like to look briefly at the fact that parental alienation is a recognised term for the phenomenon that we're discussing today. Also, we are increasingly using the term resist refuse. And also, with a nod to Philip Marcus from Israel, the child family court judge, he has described parental alienation as parent-child contact problems. And I probably will talk a little bit more about this as we go, but just before we move on to the next little question, I would say that it's my experience increasingly that the term parental alienation can be very inflammatory, which is not to the advantage of the victims of this phenomenon. So I'll talk more about this as quickly as I can as we go. Yeah.
Well, that probably leads us, Jill, to what is your position on parental alienation, given you work with so many families?
Yeah. Well, my position is, look, there have been over 1,300 articles written about it, substantial number of books, chapters, a raft of empirical studies. So we know that parental alienation exists. We know that it's an abuse and it's a situation of unjustified rejection of a parent by a child. It's important to have a look at the different forms that parental alienation can take, and I know it can get into contentious ground to try and deconstruct the phenomenon, but I do think that anyone that's seriously wanting to understand parental alienation has to tough out the disclaimers and the deconstruction to some extent. We know that longitudinal studies are absolutely clear that, I focus on parents and children in my work because my client is the family. But when I look at certain areas of the impact of high conflict, it is the children that I'm very, very concerned about, who are parents too, but children get very injured with a result that lasts a lifetime, with a cascade of child abuse outcomes, and further to that, intergenerational patterns get laid down. So we are talking about a very, very serious situation. So I probably make my position on it back there with that point.
And Jill, you mentioned the impact on the parents, but I noted that you made reference to the impact on the children as well. As a community, as a society, what changes are required? Because this impact right through to children is serious.
Well, I think it's incredibly important, and I won't keep apologizing for repeating myself on this, that we are able to look at early intervention where families are separating and there is conflict. And this needs to be part of the way that we work with families, and we do need to be looking where possible at prevention, and I will talk about this as I go on to talk. We need to understand the differentiation in parental alienation. We need to understand that the process is urgent and needs to develop in an evidence base. And so I suppose where I'm going with this is most of all, we need education and training for professionals, education for the community at large, a greater understanding of what it is that we are talking about.
In real time right now for both audiences, we are getting comments thanking already both of you for coming along, because one of the comments is saying you're already educating us by having this conversation. So thank you for making that point, Jill. For the audience that is there live in Hobart, for the audience that's watching online, what can people watching this actually do? What change or what actions can they do right now?
All right, well, I suppose it depends whether you are a parent, family member, a professional. Most of all, what we all need is to get as informed as possible. Knowledge is power, as we all know. I think that it's incumbent on social policy to make early intervention a very, very high priority for families. It's therefore massively incumbent on the professionals who work in early intervention family conflict and those who see it at the other end, judges, lawyers, psychologists, to really understand their topic extremely well. I think as professionals too, it's important to actually ask the professional development which centres on phenomenon of parental alienation. So that would be my brief responses to that question.
Yeah, and I appreciate the brevity of your answers, and I'm actually in a moment going to open up to yourself and Cheryl and some others with questions live from the audience. Can we go another layer deeper there?
Yeah.
Jill? What responsibility does the community have for referring cases of parental alienation to the appropriate professionals?
What responsibility, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. What responsibility does the
responsibility does the community have for referring cases of parental alienation to the appropriate professionals?
Well, look, I do think there's a clear responsibility, given that we know parental alienation is abuse, then we have exactly the same responsibility that we do when we come across any abuse. I think, Brady, it might be helpful if I could just do a very quick whistle-stop tour about a little bit more context before we dig into those particular questions. Do we have the time for that?
Yeah, we can. I think this is important, Jill. Yeah.
Okay, well, look, I'll be as brief as I can. Yes, I have just written a book. I'm almost cross-eyed with editing, and I don't recommend it as a relaxing pursuit for anybody. Because I'm a type of punishment. Some years ago, I wrote a book called Hello, I'm a Voice, Let Me Talk, child included in mediation and family separation. Suffice to say that was the starting bell for 22 years solid of lobbying government policy to allow children to be part of a process that their parents were involved in to resolve dispute resolution. I've worked extensively in family work, and I think that for me, the aha moment was when I invoiced our Justice Department for some work I did with parents, which I won't go into the details, but back in the day, it was funded by our family court. And the invoice was refused on the basis that I'd had the temerity to involve children in the process. So I think, you know, the madness of that particular situation kept me moving towards the fact that we had to have this passed into law. Parents who can hear where their child is at are far more likely to be attuned and to be responsive to resolving the conflict. Children, we know, do a lot better when they're able to be part of the process. So you could say, briefly, there is no legal solution that comes close to the impact of one parent recognizing the position of the other parent in relation to the same child. Okay, you can say easier said than done, and that's absolutely the case with the most intransigent cases of parental alienation and the incumbent mental health issues that go with it. I do stress, though, that we are often on a sort of continuum, and the resist-refuse phenomenon can manifest and tends to manifest at a time when a child is absolutely unable to continue with the parental dispute, which is having a dreadful psychological effect on them. So, you know, I'd love to give a couple of little stories and case studies, but I'm very conscious of time and that you need the time for the questions. But I do have two very brief ones, one of which I think is a resist-refuse situation, and the other which is absolutely clearly parental alienation. Do we have the time for that? Because I don't.
Yes, please. The comments are coming in saying this is very valuable. So yes, if you could give the study example.
Okay. I'm used to talking quite quickly, so I'll talk very this. And apologies to anyone who's heard this one before. I tend to roll it out at conferences and so on because I think it's such a good metaphor. But a little client, and with a nod to the previous speaker, to Cheryl, this does tie in a little bit with what she was talking about, which perhaps we can talk about later. But a little client, aged 7, came to see me. He was in and out of hospital with tummy pains, psychogenic, no surprises there. School picked it up and got this little boy who was very wan and distressed and unable to focus and so on. And so in various ways it came to me. The little boy told me problem in the whole world was giving him a choice of paint colour for his new bedroom. And he said, Jill, I can't choose because mummy loves green and daddy loves blue. This little boy was in such a dreadful, anxious state that he'd lost his 7-year-old ability to have a favourite colour. And so this is actually, truly a true story, but also quite a valuable metaphor. This was a resist-refuse situation which was well on its way to becoming a situation where the child starting to refuse to go to one of his parents because he was so upset. Children either become ill or they start refusing, okay? I just want to give a very quick outline of the other case, which is a girl of 13 who we will call Ruth, who was the child of profound parental conflict. Mum started to tell this little girl that dad had sexually abused her. Long story short, went through a number of family court iterations. The judge determined that this wasn't the case. It was unfounded. The child was situation was ordered. The child resumed contact with her father. She wouldn't. Roll on through a lot of distress, a lot of difficulty. Mum suddenly announced she was going to emigrate. Of course, Dad was not prepared to allow Mum to leave the country because he wasn't seeing this child, and that would be the end for him. Mum went anyway, having got the 2 family dogs euthanized and sold the house. She left the country. The child was left with the only choice of returning to a father who she'd been led to believe was a sexual abuser, or to go into care. So, what I say when I teach this work is, could that second case possibly have resolved in what we call family dispute resolution? That second case, the first one, yes, it did resolve. The parents became sensitized to what was happening and were able to work with the child on to lower, if not lower the conflict. The second case, there's absolutely no way that it would be appropriate to try and resolve that without court assistance and court orders, and even then it didn't work. All right, I've gabbled. I can stop now, but suffice to say, it's a public health issue, and we need to be really, really serious about understanding.
Jill, you've made that abundantly clear, and we are so grateful for your time. And going live right now, the comments and the questions are already flowing through. We've just had a comment from someone in the audience saying that I work in child protection, and I wholly agree with both speakers there. Thank you for sharing these experts and for helping us educate not only ourselves as professionals, but the public. So